My name is Zachary, and 6 months ago I thought I understood my calling as a pastor. I'd spent 8 years serving at St. Matthew's Episcopal Church in a progressive suburb of Seattle, where my ministry focused on creating an inclusive community that welcomed people regardless of their background or struggles. I believe deeply in a God of love and acceptance, and I'd built my pastoral approach around helping people find peace with themselves and their faith. What I hadn't expected was how my own understanding of love and faith would be challenged when Owen Richardson began attending our Sunday services, carrying burdens that would test both his faith and mine in ways I never could have anticipated. Owen first appeared at St. Matthew's on a rainy Sunday morning in October, sitting alone in the back pew, with the careful posture of someone who wasn't sure they belonged. He was probably in his late 20s, with dark hair and thoughtful brown eyes that seemed to be searching for something he couldn't quite name. During the service, I noticed him listening intently to the sermon, taking notes in a small notebook, but when we reached the pastoral prayer, he bowed his head with an expression of such profound sadness that it stayed with me long after the service ended. After the benediction, as congregants gathered for coffee and fellowship in the parish hall, Owen slipped out quietly without speaking to anyone. It was the kind of departure that suggested someone wrestling with difficult questions. Someone who wanted to be part of a faith community, but wasn't sure they'd be welcomed. He returned the following Sunday, and the Sunday after that, always sitting in the same back pew, always leaving quickly after the service. I found myself watching for him, noticing the way he engaged with the liturgy and scripture readings, seeing someone who clearly had a deep relationship with faith, but seemed to be struggling with something that kept him on the periphery of community. After his fourth visit, I decided to approach him during the coffee hour. I waited until most of the congregation had settled into conversations, then made my way to where Owen was standing near the exit, clearly preparing to leave. "Owen, isn't it?" I said, extending my hand. "I'm Pastor Zachary. I've noticed you've been joining us for worship, and I wanted to personally welcome you to St. Matthew's." Owen looked surprised that I knew his name, then shook my hand with a grip that was firm but brief. "Thank you, Pastor. The services have been meaningful." "I'm glad to hear that. Have you had a chance to explore our community programs? We have discussion groups, volunteer opportunities, social events. Lots of ways to connect with other members. I appreciate that, but I'm not sure I'm ready for community involvement just yet." There was something in Owen's tone that suggested this wasn't about shyness or scheduling conflicts. This was about someone who wasn't sure they belonged in a faith community, despite clearly wanting to be there. Reassuringly, "Of course, everyone's spiritual journey moves at its own pace. But Owen, I want you to know that if you ever want to talk about faith, about questions you might have, about anything really, my office hours are Tuesday and Thursday afternoons, and I'm always available for pastoral conversations." Owen studied my face for a moment, as if trying to determine whether my offer was genuine or just pastoral courtesy. "Thank you," he said finally. "I might take you up on that." "I hope you will. And Owen, I'm glad you're here. Truly." Owen continued attending services regularly, and I found myself looking forward to seeing him each Sunday. He gradually began staying longer during coffee hour, engaging in brief conversations with other congregants, but he still maintained a careful distance from deeper community involvement. 3 weeks after our initial conversation, Owen appeared at my office during Thursday afternoon hours. I was reviewing sermon notes when my assistant knocked on the door. Politely, "Pastor Zachary, Owen Richardson is here to see you. He doesn't have an appointment, but he wondered if you might have a few minutes." Welcomingly, "Of course. Please send him in." Owen entered my office, looking nervous but determined. the expression of someone who had made a difficult decision and was committed to following through despite their anxiety. "Owen, please sit down. Can I get you coffee or water?" "Coffee would be good, thank you." I poured 2 cups from the coffee maker I kept in my office, then settled into the chair across from Owen rather than behind my desk. Pastoral conversations worked better when they felt like dialogue rather than formal meetings. "What's on your mind?" Owen was quiet for a moment, staring into his coffee cup as if the answers to his questions might be found there. Nervously, "Pastor Zachary, I need to ask you something, and I need you to be honest with me." Reassuringly, "Of course." Vulnerable. "Is there room in Christianity for people who are different? People who don't fit the traditional expectations of what a faithful life is supposed to look like?" The question was carefully worded, but I could hear the deeper concern underneath it. This was someone asking whether their authentic self was compatible with their faith. "Owen, I believe that God's love is bigger than any human understanding of tradition or expectation. The gospel I preach is one of radical inclusion, that every person is beloved by God exactly as they are, even if they're struggling with parts of themselves that they've been taught are sinful, especially then. Owen, some of the most faithful people I know are those who've had to wrestle with difficult questions about identity and belonging. That wrestling often leads to a deeper, more authentic relationship with God." Owen looked up from his coffee cup, and I could see hope warring with skepticism in his brown eyes. What if the struggle is about something fundamental? Something that can't be changed or prayed away? I had a growing sense of what Owen was really asking, but I waited for him to find his own words rather than making assumptions. "Owen, can you tell me more specifically what you're struggling with?" Owen took a deep breath, then looked directly at me, with the courage of someone who had decided to risk vulnerability. "I'm gay, Pastor Zachary. I've known since I was a teenager, and I've spent the last 10 years trying to reconcile that with my faith. I've prayed. I've attended conversion therapy. I've tried dating women. I've done everything I was told would help me become the kind of person God supposedly wants me to be. And how has that worked for you?" It hasn't. If anything, it's made me feel further from God, not closer. But I was raised in a church that taught me that being gay was incompatible with being a faithful Christian, and I don't know how to let go of that teaching. I felt a deep sadness for the pain Owen had clearly endured, and anger at the religious communities that had taught him to see his identity as a barrier to God's love. "Owen, I'm so sorry you've carried this burden for so long. And I want you to know that what you were taught about sexuality and faith, that's not the gospel I preach, and it's not the God I serve." "What do you mean?" "I mean that the God I know is a God of love, not condemnation. The gospel I preach says that you are fearfully and wonderfully made, that your identity, including your sexuality, is part of how God created you." Owen stared at me as if I'd spoken in a foreign language. "You really believe that?" "I absolutely believe that. Owen, our congregation includes many LGBTQ+ members who are faithful, contributing, beloved parts of our community. Your sexuality doesn't disqualify you from God's love or from full participation in the church, but sincerely. The Bible is a complex collection of texts written in specific historical contexts, and faithful people have different interpretations of what those texts mean for contemporary Christians. What I know for certain is that Jesus' primary commandments were to love God and love your neighbor as yourself. Nothing about your identity prevents you from living those commandments fully. Owen was quiet for a long time, processing what I'd said. I could see years of internalized shame and religious trauma warring with the possibility of acceptance and belonging. Hesitantly, "Pastor Zachary, would it be possible to continue these conversations? I have so many questions, and I've never talked to a pastor who, surprised, who said things like this before." Warmly, "Of course, Owen, I'd be honored to walk alongside you as you explore these questions. Faith journeys are rarely simple, and wrestling with difficult questions is often how we grow closer to God." Relieved, "Thank you. This is the first time in years that I've felt like maybe there's hope for me to have both faith and authenticity." Emphatically, there absolutely is hope for that. In fact, I'd argue that authentic faith requires authentic self-acceptance. Over the next several weeks, Owen and I met regularly to discuss theology, identity, and the intersection of faith and sexuality. These weren't formal counseling sessions. I was careful to maintain appropriate boundaries and suggested professional counseling resources when appropriate, but rather pastoral conversations aimed at helping Owen explore questions about faith and belonging. Owen was intelligent and thoughtful, with a deep knowledge of Scripture and theology that had been shaped by years of searching for answers. Our conversations ranged from biblical interpretation to church history to practical questions about living as a gay man of faith. Curiously, "I've been reading about affirming churches," Owen said during one of our Thursday afternoon conversations. "Churches that perform same-sex marriages, ordain LGBTQ+ clergy, that kind of thing." Disbelieving. "It's hard to believe that's possible after everything I was taught growing up." Confidently. "Not only is it possible, it's happening in denominations all over the country. The Episcopal Church, where we are, officially affirms marriage equality and ordains LGBTQ+ clergy. Many Presbyterian, Methodist, Lutheran, and other denominations have similar policies." Directly. "And you personally, how do you reconcile your faith with supporting LGBTQ+ people?" Passionately. "Owen, I don't see those as things that need reconciling. I see supporting LGBTQ+ people as a direct expression of my faith. Jesus consistently reached out to people who were marginalized by— No, I'll be honest, I grew up in a more conservative tradition, and my understanding of these issues has evolved through study, prayer, and relationships with LGBTQ+ people of faith. Sometimes our theology grows as our hearts open." What changed your mind? I thought about how to answer that question honestly. Several things. Biblical scholarship that helped me understand historical context. Seeing the fruits of inclusion versus exclusion in church communities. But mostly, it was meeting faithful LGBTQ+ Christians and recognizing that their relationships with God were as authentic and meaningful as anyone else's. Do you think I could have that? An authentic relationship with God that doesn't require me to deny who I am? Owen, I think you already have that relationship. I see it in the way you engage with worship, the thoughtful questions you ask, the sincerity of your faith journey. You don't need to become someone different to be acceptable to God. You need to become more fully yourself. That's a radical idea for someone with my background. The gospel is pretty radical, always has been. As our conversations continued, I watched Owen gradually shed layers of shame and self-doubt that had accumulated over years of being taught that his identity was incompatible with his faith. He began participating more actively in church activities, joined our book discussion group, and even volunteered for our community service projects. More importantly, he began to carry himself differently, with less defensive tension, more genuine engagement with others, and what I could only describe as growing peace with himself. "Pastor Zachary," Owen said during one of our conversations in December, "I want to thank you for these past few months. You've given me something I didn't think was possible." "What's that?" "Hope. For the first time in my adult life, I feel like I might be able to be both gay and Christian without those identities being in constant conflict." "Owen, you've done the hard work of questioning, exploring, and choosing faith over fear. I've just been privileged to walk alongside you during that process. It's more than that. You've shown me a version of Christianity that actually feels like good news instead of constant judgment and condemnation. That's what the gospel is supposed to be. Good news. I'm glad you're beginning to experience it that way. I am. And Pastor Zachary, I need to tell you something else." "What's that?" Owen looked at me with an expression that was both grateful and something else I couldn't quite identify. "Sincerely. These conversations with you, this journey of reconciling my faith and identity, it's been the most meaningful spiritual experience of my life. And you've been more than just a pastor to me. You've been exactly the person I needed to meet at exactly the right time." There was something in Owen's tone that suggested his feelings about our relationship had evolved beyond pastoral gratitude, and I felt a flutter of concern about maintaining appropriate boundaries. "Owen, I'm honored that our conversations have been helpful to you. That's what pastoral ministry is supposed to be, helping people grow in their relationship with God and their understanding of themselves. I know that. And I hope I'm not overstepping by saying this, but Zachary, you've become important to me in ways that go beyond pastoral guidance. The use of my first name without the pastoral title felt significant, and I realized that somewhere during our months of conversation, the nature of our relationship had begun shifting in ways that I needed to address carefully. Owen, I want to make sure we're both clear about boundaries here. I'm your pastor, and while I care deeply about your spiritual journey, it's important that our relationship remain appropriate to those roles. Vulnerable. I understand that. But Zachary, what if I said that my feelings for you have developed beyond spiritual gratitude? What if I said that I've come to care about you as a person, not just as a pastor? The conversation had moved into territory that required extreme care. Owen was vulnerable, having recently begun to accept his sexuality and integrate it with his faith. Any response I gave could either support his growing self-acceptance or potentially damage his spiritual progress. Owen, I'm deeply moved that you feel comfortable sharing your feelings with me. That level of trust and openness shows how much you've grown in accepting yourself. Seriously, I need to be very careful about how I respond, because my primary responsibility is to your spiritual well-being and growth. Any romantic feelings between us would complicate that responsibility in ways that could be harmful to both of us. Owen nodded, but I could see disappointment in his expression. Resignedly. I understand the professional boundaries, Zachary. Hopeful. But can I ask you a personal question? Cautiously. You can ask. I may not be able to answer depending on what it is. Vulnerable. Do you feel anything for me beyond pastoral concern? It was exactly the question I've been hoping to avoid, because the honest answer was complicated in ways that professional ethics made difficult to navigate. Thoughtfully. Owen, you're an intelligent, thoughtful, faithful person who's shown tremendous courage in wrestling with difficult questions. Anyone would find those qualities attractive. That's not really an answer. It's the only answer I can give while maintaining appropriate boundaries. What if there is a way to change those boundaries? What if I transferred to another church, Found a different pastor for spiritual guidance. Owen, making major life decisions based on romantic feelings for your pastor would be exactly the kind of choice I'd want to counsel you against. You've found a spiritual home here, a community where you're accepted and valued. Don't give that up lightly. But what if I'm not giving it up? What if I'm just changing the nature of my relationship with one person in that community? The conversation was becoming increasingly difficult to navigate. Owen's feelings were genuine and understandable. He'd found acceptance and spiritual guidance from someone who'd helped him integrate his faith and sexuality, and it was natural that those feelings might develop into attraction. But my responsibility as his pastor required me to prioritize his spiritual well-being over any personal feelings I might have. Owen, I think we need to step back from this conversation, not because your feelings are wrong or inappropriate, but because discussing them puts both of us in a difficult position. Zachary, please, just tell me honestly, if circumstances were different, if we'd met in some other context, would there be a possibility for something between us? I looked at Owen across my office, this man who'd shown such courage in reconciling his faith and identity, who'd trusted me with his deepest struggles and fears, and I realized that complete honesty about my own feelings might be the most pastoral response I could offer. Yes, I said quietly. If circumstances were different, if we'd met as equals rather than pastor and congregant, I think there would definitely be a possibility. Owen's expression brightened with hope and relief. Really? Really? Owen, you're exactly the kind of person I'd be drawn to. Intelligent, thoughtful, spiritually mature, courageous enough to ask difficult questions and pursue authentic answers. Then why can't we explore that possibility? Because right now, exploring it would violate the trust you've placed in me as your pastor. Your spiritual journey is too important to risk for the sake of romantic feelings. What if I'm willing to take that risk? I'm not willing to let you take it. Owen, you've spent years believing that your identity was incompatible with your faith. You've finally found a spiritual community where you can be authentic and accepted. I won't be responsible for jeopardizing that. Owen was quiet for a long time, and I could see him processing the conflict between his growing feelings and the practical realities of our situation. Thoughtful. So what happens now? Measured. Now we continue the pastoral relationship that's been so meaningful for your spiritual growth. We maintain appropriate boundaries while you continue to flourish in your faith journey. Curious. And the feelings? Firmly. The feelings are acknowledged, but not acted upon, at least, not while I'm your pastor. Perceptive. While you're my pastor, does that mean you're considering a change? It was a perceptive question, and one that I wasn't entirely prepared to answer. The truth was that my own spiritual calling had been evolving during my conversations with Owen, partly because of his influence, and partly because of broader changes in how I understood ministry and community. Carefully. I've been considering some changes in my ministry, yes, but not because of personal feelings, because of professional growth and calling. Inquiring. What kind of changes? Explaining. I've been offered a position with a progressive Christian organization that focuses on LGBTQ+ advocacy and education. It would mean leaving parish ministry to do broader educational and social justice work. Surprised. And you're interested in that? Enthusiastic. Very interested. It feels like a natural evolution of the ministry work I care most about. Practical. When would that happen? Reassuring. If I decide to accept the position, probably in the spring, it would give me time to help St. Matthew's find a good replacement and ensure a smooth transition. Owen was quiet, and I could see him considering the implications of what I'd shared. Serious. Zachary, if you took that position, would our professional relationship change? Directly. It would. You'd have a new pastor, and I'd be working in a completely different context. Hopeful. And then? Tenderly. And then we'd be two people who care about each other, with no professional barriers to exploring what that might mean. Vulnerable. Is that something you'd want to explore? I looked at Owen, this man who'd become so important to me over the past few months, whose spiritual journey had inspired my own growth, whose presence had begun to feel essential to my understanding of meaningful work and meaningful relationships. Earnestly. Yes, I said honestly. It's something I'd very much want to explore. Owen's smile was radiant, transforming his entire face with joy and hope. Softly. So we wait? Calmly. We wait. We continue the pastoral relationship that's been so meaningful for both of us. We support your continued spiritual growth. And when the time is right, we see what might be possible between us as equals. Relieved. 4 months later, I officially accepted the position with the Christian Advocacy Organization and began the process of transitioning away from parish ministry. Owen continued to flourish at St. Matthew's, becoming increasingly involved in church leadership and serving as a mentor for other LGBTQ+ individuals navigating questions of faith and identity. My last Sunday as pastor was in May, and Owen was there in his usual pew, though no longer in the back row. He'd gradually moved forward over the months, literally and figuratively taking his place in the community. After the farewell reception, as the church emptied and I packed up my office, Owen appeared in my doorway. Thoughtful. So, he said, how does it feel to be just Zachary instead of Pastor Zachary? Thoughtful. Strange. Liberating. A little scary. Curious. And what happens now? Now I start a new job doing work I'm passionate about. Now you continue growing in your faith and leadership here at St. Matthew's. And now, we find out what's possible between us, without professional complications. Eagerly. I've been looking forward to that conversation for months. Warmly. So have I. Owen stepped into my office and closed the door behind him. Zachary, I know we've talked about waiting until your pastoral role ended, but I need to tell you something. Curious. What? Sincerely. I love you. Not just as someone who helped me reconcile my faith and identity, though I'm grateful for that. I love you as a person. Your intelligence, your compassion, your willingness to ask difficult questions and pursue authentic answers. Emotionally. Owen, I love you too. These past months of walking alongside you in your spiritual journey have been some of the most meaningful of my ministry, and watching you grow into authentic self-acceptance has been one of the greatest privileges of my life. Hopeful. So what happens next? Playfully. Next, I take you to dinner. As Zachary, who's interested in Owen, not as Pastor Zachary providing spiritual guidance. Happily. I'd like that very much. When Owen kissed me for the first time, it was in my empty office, surrounded by boxes and the remnants of 8 years of parish ministry. It tasted like hope and new beginnings, like faith that had been tested and found strong enough to support authentic love. Thoughtful. Any regrets? Owen asked, as we prepared to leave the church that had brought us together. Cuccles, about leaving parish ministry? I looked around the office, where Owen and I had spent so many hours discussing faith and identity, where he'd found the courage to integrate his sexuality with his spirituality, where we'd both discovered that love, divine and human, was bigger and more inclusive than either of us had originally understood. None, I said honestly, reflectively. Though I never expected that helping someone else find their spiritual path would lead me to find my own new direction. Sometimes the best ministry happens when we're brave enough to be authentic about who we are and what we need. And sometimes the most important spiritual guidance comes from being willing to love without condition. As we walked out of St. Matthew's together for the last time as pastor and congregant, I marveled at how completely both our lives had changed since that October morning when Owen first appeared in our back pew. He'd found acceptance and spiritual peace. I'd discovered new directions for ministry and love. Sometimes, the most profound spiritual transformations happen, not through sermons or scripture study, but through the courage to be authentic and the willingness to love without reservation.